So, how does a world that thinks it's at the absolute peak of civilization just plunges itself into a self-destructive war? That's what we're talking about today. We're going to explore what's been called the great seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, the First World War. And we're going to try and figure out how it all went so horribly wrong.
And to really get a handle on the sheer scale of this cataclysm, you have to start right here with this quote from diplomat George F. Kennan. I mean, he didn't just see it as another war, right? For him, this was the moment Western civilization just broke. So what could possibly push a world so full of confidence right over the edge into that kind of abyss?
Okay, so our story really gets going in the late 19th century. You got to picture this era of, well, supreme European confidence. It's often called high imperialism. And this was a time when a handful of powerful nations looked at the rest of the globe and they didn't see a collection of diverse cultures. Nope. They saw a map just waiting to be carved up and controlled.
And the scale of that control? It's just staggering. I mean, look at this. By 1914, right, on the very brink of the war, European empires held sway over a mind-boggling 39% of the entire Earth's land. This wasn't just about grabbing territory, you know? It was about imposing their will on millions upon millions of people. And this is the crucial part. This whole imperial project completely shaped how they thought about warfare. They actually had a specific name for these colonial campaigns, small wars. And the definition itself, wow, it just reveals so much about their mindset. This wasn't seen as a conflict between equals, not at all. It was framed as this sort of civilizing mission, where you had disciplined soldiers on one side and, well, those they called savages on the other. This whole experience, fighting these small wars, it bred a really dangerous overconfidence in their own military methods.
And this idea, it gets right to the very heart of their strategy. See, the goal wasn't just to win on the battlefield. It was about complete psychological dominance. The whole point was to make the enemy feel not just outgunned, but morally and fundamentally inferior. It was a philosophy built on this idea of their own total, unquestionable superiority.
But here's the thing. The heroic stories they told back home about colonial conquest, they almost never matched the messy, brutal reality on the ground. These weren't glorious battles. I mean, with no clear objective, no capital city to capture, no organized army to defeat, the fighting often just devolved into these brutal counterinsurgency tactics. We're talking punitive raids, village burning, just destroying people's livelihoods to completely crush any local resistance.
So, picture this. While all these empires are busy expanding abroad, something really dangerous is starting to grow back home. A kind of fragility. The very competition for these colonies started to poison the relationships between the great powers of Europe. It was literally turning the entire continent into a giant powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
For decades, this brilliant German chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, had managed to keep a really delicate peace. He did it with this incredibly complex web of alliances, almost like a master puppeteer, all designed to keep any one country from getting too powerful. But then he gets dismissed in 1890. And after that, that flexible system he built starts to harden, it gets rigid. And slowly but surely, Europe splits right down the middle into two opposing armed camps, the Triple Alliance on one side and the Triple Entente on the other.
And this right here, this is the pivotal shift. Bismarck's whole game was stability. Keep things calm. But the new guy, Kaiser Wilhelm II, totally different story. He had this much more aggressive vision he called Weltpolitik, which is basically world policy. He wanted Germany's place in the sun, as he put it, and he started building a massive navy to go after it, directly challenging Britain. And the result? Well, instead of balancing power like Bismarck did, Wilhelm's actions just set off alarm bells all across Europe. It actually ended up pushing all of Germany's rivals closer together.
Okay, but these hardening alliances, that's only half the story. The other part, and you could argue it's even more tragic, was just this catastrophic failure of imagination. You see, Europe's military leaders had all been raised on the lessons of those small wars and old 19th century battles. And because of that, they completely fundamentally misunderstood the kind of war they were about to stumble into.
And this is where the story just becomes a straight-up tragedy of imagination. On one side, you've got the entire military establishment that are all in on something called the cult of the offensive. They truly believed the next war would be short, it would be decisive, and it would be won by sheer willpower and one big, glorious charge. And then on the other side, You have a Polish banker, of all people, named Jan de Bloch. Way back in 1899, he predicted exactly what was coming: a long, grinding war of trenches and attrition, where modern firepower would make all those old tactics just suicidal. And the generals, of course, they completely ignored him.
I mean, just listen to Bloch's own words here. He's literally describing no man's land a full 15 years before it became a grim, bloody reality. He saw it all. He saw that the combination of machine guns, modern artillery, and barbed wire would create this impassable zone of death. It was a prophecy. A prophecy that, if anyone had actually listened, might have completely changed the course of history. So, what happens? What happens when a 19th century military idea, like the cult of the offensive, smashes head-on into the brutal reality of 20th century industrial weapons? Well, the result was a slaughter on a scale that humanity had never, ever seen before. And in August 1914, that's exactly what happened. All the plans, all the theories, all that misplaced confidence, it all meant the cold, hard, brutal reality of the battlefield. The short, glorious war they had all imagined, yeah, that was over in a matter of weeks. 500,000. Just let that number sink in. That was the number of German casualties in just the first month of the war. Germany's entire grand strategy, the famous Schlieffen Plan, had bet everything on a lightning-fast victory. And it failed, utterly. And the human price was just astronomical. Now let's fast forward to 1916 and to the absolute hellscape of Verdun. This wasn't a battle of clever maneuvers anymore. This was pure grinding attrition. The German strategy was as simple as it was horrifying: to literally bleed the French army white. And with over 800,000 casualties on both sides, this was it. This was the exact war Jan de Bloch had predicted. It had become a gruesome contest of who could endure the most death. And then, at the Battle of the Somme, in that very same year, the carnage somehow reached an even higher peak. We're talking over 1.3 million casualties, all sides. And for what? What was gained? After months and months of fighting, the front lines had moved just 6.5 miles. It's almost impossible to comprehend. So the tragic lesson is just laid bare right here. All those tactics they learned in the colonial small wars, this belief in the heroic charge, in their own moral superiority, it was all just completely suicidal on the Western Front. The rifle and the cavalry, they stood no chance against the machine gun and heavy artillery. It was a fatal, fatal leap from limited casualties to full-on industrial-scale slaughter. Okay, so after 4 long years of this just unimaginable horror, the guns finally go silent. But now comes a challenge that's almost as immense as the war itself. How in the world do you build a lasting peace from the ruins of a civilization? And when the victors met at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, they were deeply, and I mean fundamentally, divided on how to answer that question.
And this quote from the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, it just perfectly captures the mood. He's looking at the American president, Woodrow Wilson, and his idealistic vision for a new world order. And he just thinks it's completely naive. And you have to remember, France had been invaded by Germany twice in 50 years, so they wanted one thing above all else: security. And, yeah, probably a little bit of revenge.
So at the very heart of this conference, you had these two clashing philosophies. On one side, there was Woodrow Wilson's idealism, this grand vision of open diplomacy, freedom for nations, and a new League of Nations to make sure a war like this could never happen again. But then you had Britain and France. They were scarred by the war, and their goals were much more, well, let's call it pragmatic. They wanted to punish Germany, secure their own empires, and make absolutely sure it could never, ever be a threat again. And in the end, that pragmatism, that realism, is what won out. The Treaty of Versailles ended up imposing incredibly harsh terms on Germany. First, there was Article 231, the infamous war guilt clause, which forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame. Then it was stripped of huge chunks of territory. Its military was basically dismantled. And on top of all that, it was saddled with crippling reparations payments that would take decades to pay off. And what about Wilson's big dream, the League of Nations? Well, it was created, but it was basically crippled from day one. For starters, Germany was excluded, and then, and this is the real kicker, Wilson's own country, the United States, refused to join. So the world's first ever global peacekeeping organization was left completely toothless before it even had a chance to get started. So that leaves us with this one, final, really haunting question. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars,
but it concluded with a peace treaty that many people at the time said was really just a 20-year truce. So, in trying to solve the problems of the past, did the peacemakers at Versailles accidentally end up sowing the seeds for an even more terrible conflict? Well, that's a question history would answer all too soon.